Welcome to the Long Thread podcast about spinning, stitching, and weaving by hand. The podcast is presented by Long Thread Media, publishers of Spin-Off, Handwoven, Piecework, and Little Looms magazines. Find us online at longthreadmedia.com. Trinway Silks is where weavers, spinners, knitters, and stitchers find the silk they love. Select from the largest variety of silk spinning fibers, silk yarn, and silk threads and ribbons at trinwaysilks.com. You'll discover a rainbow of colors thoughtfully hand-dyed in Colorado. Love natural? Trinway's array of wild silks provide choices beyond white. If you love silk, you'll love Trinway Silks, where superior quality and customer service are guaranteed. The Michigan Fiber Festival, Michigan's largest sheep and wool festival, is a vibrant world of fiber arts. Discover 5 days of classes with nationally recognized teachers in spinning, weaving, lace-making, dyeing, felting, and rug hooking. Enjoy 3 days of shopping, delight in shearing and fiber arts demonstrations, and enjoy a truly immersive experience. Join us in August at the picturesque Allegan County Fairgrounds. You can even camp on site. Find more details at michiganfiberfestival.info. I'm your host, Long Thread Media co-founder Ann Marrow. Emily Whitted is a doctoral student at UMass Amherst. She studies early American history through textiles. Well, Emily, thanks so much for being with me.
Thanks for having me.
Now, I am so excited to talk to you about mending because, like I'm obsessed with mending lately, and it sounds like that's something that you are passionate about too.
It is. It's the focus of my dissertation, but also something I try and practice in my daily life too, and I feel like they both inform the other. So yeah, mending's often on the brain these days.
How did you get into that as an academic study?
So I had a chance to do a master's thesis on knit stockings in early America. And I was looking for a particular type of stockings in museum collections to study material evidence, and was going through hundreds of pairs of stockings and noticed that a lot of them were mended, but the mends weren't really mentioned in catalog records in museums, or, didn't seem to be something that was surfaced very regularly when talking about these objects. Repairs are often an afterthought when they're discussed on materials in museums. And so after seeing so many pairs, I was like, I'm really curious about this. There's got to be something there. Who's doing this labor? What is it telling us about these objects if they've been repaired? And then I found a really spectacular pair of mended stockings at the collection of Girard College in Philadelphia. They were owned and worn by Stephen Girard, who at the time was one of the wealthiest men in early America, and they're extensively mended and darned with multiple techniques. And having the chance to study those was really the launching point for the dissertation. I just thought this object is inspiring me to do more research and to want to write hundreds of pages on mending. And so here we are.
I'm going to ask you a little bit more about your studies in a minute, but I'm really curious, how were these things mended? Were they mended in the way that we would recognize now, where you're either doing a woven or a knitted mend? Or, what do you see when you come across one of these pieces?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think there's a lot more similarities between what's mended in the past and what techniques we use today. So woven darns I've seen before. I've seen Swiss darns or duplicate knit stitch pairs, although that's very rare, just in my experience of what I've looked at in my time period. Doesn't mean that it was rare to do it. It's just that the number of objects that survive are already a biased form of evidence. And so we know that many people use that technique through paper records, but it's just rare to find them on textiles that survive. And then honestly, there's something so accessible to the way things are quickly mended that I've seen, where it might not look like a formal technique of woven darning, but just threads just kind of snaked across little rips in fabric where that they're moving quickly. They're just trying to get that textile to function a little bit longer. There's something really accessible, I think, about that, because it just means also early Americans are taking 20 minutes out of their day to fix something. In many ways, we're trying to do the same today. So yeah, it heartens me, I think, the continuity of different techniques from the past that are still present today.
So there are paper records people were writing about mending?
Oh, yes. Yeah. This is part of my project's kind of motivation, is that you need to see both surviving evidence and museum collections, but also look at paper records to understand how repair is kind of systematically infused into daily life. The best sources usually for me have been diaries and household account books, where you can see the kind of materials early Americans are purchasing in order to repair their textiles, as well as daily entries of men and women who are saying, today I darned my coat, or today I mended a sock. And not everybody writes with that intention. Some people only want to highlight the new things they're making, which is also totally understandable. But there's, for everyone who's wanting to talk about making, there's somebody else who wants to talk about what they're fixing. And those sources have been really special for me to kind of read in their own words what that labor of mending is. It's not always descriptive, though. They'll say, mended my coat, I mended my socks, I mended, my shirt. And you don't quite know what that looks like or how they might approach that until you look at material evidence too, to better understand the complexity and the creativity that goes into repair.
It's hard enough in some ways to see what textiles people were using in the past. It's one of those sort of ephemeral or things that wear away. So finding cloth at all, let alone cloth that's mended, let alone writing about cloth that's mended, it's so interesting to me that you can find these little snippets of daily life that were not dramatic or public.
Yeah, it feels like very intimate research most of the time to kind of get into the daily rhythms of early Americans and what they're doing. And I think that has always been an interest for me, what are average people thinking and feeling in the past. But it's, I think, also trend in the field of early American history right now, that a good one, that they're trying to expand the material and information we can get from archives that might not have been previously mined with that in mind. So for me, it is a lot of needle in a haystack digging, but the archives, at least the paper archives that I visit, those have been read by other historians, but they've never come with this particular set of questions about repair. And once you start to look for it, you see it everywhere. And part of that is because textiles are so valuable in this time period that effort to repair is always going to be something an early American is going to go through before they discard. So the proclivity of where repair is everywhere. It's also embedded in businesses like the maritime industry when they're making sailcloth, or military records have been really fruitful for me too, looking at how textiles are repaired in the American Revolution when the demand for textiles is so high and there's a real scarcity for the Army's use. So pockets like that really show to me, where is repair work organized systematically, and also how is it culturally embedded in the daily fabric of early American life.
I think of this sort of work as being so very gendered and gendered to be female, and yet you're talking about maritime life, and maybe there were, I don't know whether there were both men and women working on sailcloths and on the docks, but there were certainly not all that many women who were sewing them on board a ship. And then when I think about people were making these swifts or little mending kits to send off to war with men. So there's a point at which this is not so much of just a female fireside pursuit.
No, absolutely. I think that's an important takeaway for the project, and challenge some of my own assumptions too going into it. How many men are mending in relation to women? I always try and emphasize that women are overwhelmingly the preference for the labor of repair, textile repair. If women are unavailable, men will often pick up that labor, with the exception of some of these professional needle trades where men have been the focus, like tailors or sailmakers, which is predominantly done by men until kind of the very late 19th century. But women sailmakers are very rare. So there is that kind of gender division in, tailoring versus mantua making, where women would be making clothing instead of men. And both of them would have the ability to repair textiles as part of their occupation. But often, it's especially apparent to me in settings on ships and in military camps, how much many men relied on women until they were placed in an environment where women's labor is either inaccessible entirely or maybe too expensive for them to afford. So they are writing in diaries or in letters, struggling to learn to sew, sometimes for the first time in these settings. And there's some wonderful soldiers' accounts of repairing. There's a surgeon in the Continental Army who's at Valley Forge who writes in his diary of learning to Swiss darn a sock for the first time. And although surgeons also use needles in their occupation too, so it may not have been as foreign an experience as it was for other soldiers, but many struggled. And the same with sailors who write back really, really grappling with having to learn to sew. But it actually was a pretty essential skill for sailors to have as part of their occupation, not just for their own personal clothing, but also for sail repair along their journeys. So they absolutely had to embrace that learning curve. But I also see in diaries by men in different settings too, writing about repairing their own clothing too. So I think those gendered assumptions are good to challenge, but also to underscore that this is so much a story about women's labor and their needlework traditions more than anything else in a domestic and in professional settings when it comes to clothing.
There's so much emphasis on mending and make, do, and mend in contemporary culture. I think there's a lot of interesting ways that things are similar and things are different. And when I think about my own family, my dad is the one who darns the socks. He still turns his cuffs and collars. He removes them and turns them over and sews them back on again. His mother taught him and his brother to sew. And he has both of his grandmother's sewing machines. And sometimes you'll see my dad and his brother standing there, and they will have ripped their jeans in the exact same place and mended it in just the same way.
Oh, I love that.
But it is unusual. I remember it's one of those stories where, I'm sorry, I'm dominating here, but when I was a kid, I guess a little girl came over to play and she ripped something of hers. And I said, well, why don't you just have your dad fix that for you? And what the thing that sticks out in that is, well, of course we have this cultural assumption that it would be your mom who would fix that for you, but I didn't have that assumption. It would be your dad who would fix that for you. So we're talking about these folks who are going off to camps and going out to ships, and who does the mending?
Yeah. I love that story. I think, so often for contemporary audiences, when I talk about my project, the connection is through what they learn from their mother or their grandmother and the kind of line of women and their families. And I think that's absolutely, an important piece of the puzzle. But there's so many men today who sew too. And I just love that that's a facet of your experience and approach to mending too. I hope it also is inspiring as a historical touchstone for how repair is done, that these long histories of men with needles exist already, tailoring, sailmaking, shoemaking too involves needles where men are dominant. And it's really not until the kind of 19th century, mid-19th century, where I see some gendered anxieties from men about that labor, where there's like a period where sailors on ships are writing about their sewing together as sewing bees or sewing parties, right around the time when women's kind of social sewing and the feminization of needlework is really taking hold in the US. And you can just see that some sailors are really kind of struggling to process their own labor in relation to that. Because before that, they used to touch upon the history of tailoring, thinking about themselves as, men busy in a tailor shop when they're on the ships. And suddenly they switch to sewing bees or sewing parties. And you can see that kind of gendered anxiety, like who can sew, who should be sewing. And that anxiety is kind of fun to track in that moment.
Another assumption that I think has come up and changed over the years is what mending says about class. And you mentioned that this Mr. Girard was quite wealthy, and yet he had mended stockings. And then there was a period of time where having things that needed to be repaired and worn again was an indication that you weren't that well off. And now we see people wearing mends as a sign of sort of pride, because skill with your hands and creativity and time are also something that's highly prized. So was the mending always done by someone who was less economically advantaged?
It's actually, I think, the main takeaway of the project for me that truly everyone is mending in early America, regardless of class. But the ways in which they are mending differ based on these kind of negative class or racial connotations in the time period. So I see evidence of repair happening in the wealthiest households, as well as the most economically disenfranchised members of early American society. But there is a push to make your mends more invisible, to hide them from view. And for those who can afford that labor, that works quite well, especially if you have more garments in rotation. The value of textiles, primarily that the pure economic value, would motivate anyone, regardless of how wealthy they are, to attempt to repair first before they do anything else. But Girard stockings, for example, are only repaired from the ankle down. So they would have been hidden inside his shoes. And I think that's really intentional on the, of course, the damage is down there, and that's not surprising for a pair of socks, but also that meant that those could be worn and also the mends would be out of view. That's really, I think, really important to why that existed as long as it did in his wardrobe. And I see examples of that on many other early American textiles that survive today. You'll see people going to great lengths to reuse the fabric from the original garment to patch, sometimes trying to really line up if it's patterned, to line up that pattern so it's as invisible as possible. The same with woven darns and trying to match thread colors if possible, and also strategically trying to make sure those mends aren't seen when they're worn on the body or they're put in front of the public eye. But then if you can't avoid that, you might, if you're wealthy enough, you might rotate that garment that's damaged, obviously damaged, and just wear that at home, within the comfort of your home. But then if company came to call you out in public, you would put on your better garments. There are so many examples of that effort. And then there's so many examples of really obvious repairs, where there's no helping it, that I'm thinking of, a set of trousers that's at the collection of University of Rhode Island that, it's this great blue and white pair of trousers, and they've tried to patch the knees several times in kind of complementary fabrics, and then the seat blows out and they're just like, all we've got's a yellow plaid, and we're just going to put it is just a big yellow plaid patch on the back. And there's no way that would be unavoidably noticeable in that time period. So there are a lot of, I think, cultural meanings embedded in seeing someone with repaired clothing in the past. Some of that is negative, the idea that this is a sign of poverty. It's also a tool for surveillance, which is a piece of my project I've been thinking a little bit more about, where mends that are noticeable become something someone could document. So, for example, enslaved people who are trying to self-emancipate, and there might be a runaway ad in a newspaper that describes them and their clothing. Mends really stand out in those sources. So you see not only the prevalence of how many people are going around in mended clothing, but if you notice it, it may mean someone could be identified or put at risk. So there's that component as well. And you see a lot of print culture, visual culture, circulating prints that talk about and depict damaged clothing to kind of signal very quickly to audiences the class or race of someone. Alongside some of the kind of risks of surveillance and the negative connotations of mending, there's also a level of moral thrift that's being signaled with repair in that time period, where part of being a good housekeeper or wife or family member or citizen of your community, if you couldn't afford to not wear repaired clothing in front of others, the way it was done or the way it could signal perhaps good moral values of thrift and economy rather than waste is another motivating factor for people to repair their clothing. So when it is visible, it's interesting also to see who reacts to it from a lens of, this is a good person who's he's not being wasteful. His family is trying to use up everything at their availability. And then there's others who, if you look ragged and dirty, there's some negative connotations. So that division between mended versus ragged is a really interesting piece of the puzzle in early America.
You've mentioned that there are records of people writing about mending, but I think I remember you saying that the mends in these stockings were not necessarily documented, and that when people are doing this intensive work, even if the pieces remain, you can't always tell how much work somebody has put into it after they made it when you get it in a museum.
Yeah, it's a very layered, I think, history that repaired textiles tell us. And museums for a long time have not been as interested in picking apart those layers. And there's, several reasons for that. The first being that museums have been created with an intention of highlighting objects that look more pristine, and repairs are often assumed to kind of detract from the object's whole. And conservators work very hard to make it visually as unobtrusive as possible. But I think that there's a really important piece of information when you know that something is repaired, because it signals that someone is caring for this after its creation. And research into objects often focuses on the making of an object and sometimes the consumption of that object, and sometimes more and more now the use of that object. But repair is this cyclical relationship with an object where if something is damaged, someone is feeling like that object is worth putting the time into to care for and repair again. That, I think, is really powerful. It signals not only the longevity of something in someone's life or lifetimes, but also a set of values that someone has placed in that object beyond when it was purchased, beyond when it was made, but what role it has in that person's life now. Museums have, I think, more and more been really excited about this. And I see this now in exhibits more often in even the last 2 years than I have when I first began this project. But there is this hope that this project kind of inspires more of a public history takeaway, and that cataloging for these repairs is pretty rare. And some of that is just that museums, like many nonprofits, have tight budgets and high demands on time, and cataloging is something that takes a good amount of time, and they may not have the staff or the bandwidth to do it. But noting repairs is really important information to go alongside where that object was made, what it is, who owned it. And I think the more efforts that are poured in that direction, some really exciting, I think, interpretive stories will surface as a result. And so I'm hopeful that many museums may look again into their textile collections and discover or rediscover more repairs they might not even know they had. And that's been a very fun part of this project, is kind of going into museums and co-working with curators and saying, what do you think you have? And many folks will be like, I think we have a few things, I don't know. And then we'll start taking things out, and that number will triple, quadruple very quickly. So many textiles are repaired in museum collections. And it's been a joy to kind of discover that alongside staff and then to surface some of those stories. But I think there's so many more waiting to be surfaced by others.
Yeah. It reminds me, there was a museum here, the Avenir at Colorado State University, that had an entire exhibit of clothes turned inside out. You could see the insides. And that amount of, you use the word intimacy, that level of things that people didn't necessarily want to be out front. And you get to see inside there, in the back parlor or the kitchen or the upstairs.
Yeah, I love that. The insides are really, it's the guts, of these clothing. That's really where the exciting stories of labor, and you can really piece together how an object has gone and transformed across time. There's alterations, adjustments, all of those repairs, all of those things that you can only see from the inside. I love looking inside out first myself as well.
All this mending makes me think about sort of the most famous early American needlework, which is these samplers, mostly girl samplers that people were doing in public, that were kind of publicly evaluated, and that there are so many of now. How do these two things fit together? Samplers are decorative and mends are functional, and yet here they are.
Yeah, it's a great question, because I think that is often where many people's minds go first when they think of early American needlework. You're spot on. There is actually a subset of samplers known as darning samplers. that girls could learn to make. In America, they're very popular in England, and especially within Quaker schools of instruction. And so for early American examples, often the best collections of them are those produced by girls within Quaker schools. So Westtown School in Pennsylvania is one example. There's also other schools in Delaware, some in New England. So the darning samplers are an opportunity to practice repair work. And if we think of samplers as a progressive exercise for girls, many girls will make multiple samplers across their study with skills that start quite basic and build upon each other. So often the ones that we collect are the more elaborate ones today, but there's probably many simpler ones that girls did beforehand. And a darning sampler is often more simple compared to some of the more decorative ones. But there's a real beauty to darning samplers, I think, personally. They're often very geometric with their practices, and many of them are quite geometric in design. Some darning samplers are meant to truly repair damaged fabric. So they'll mimic, a square hole in the fabric or certain shapes of rips. And then they'll execute very fine, to my eyes, woven darns. There's also a set of samplers that don't actually repair the ground fabric at all. There's no damage going on in the back, but they mimic the weaving structures of different patterned fabric, like diaper or twill. And those are quite interesting to me because you see maybe a shift culturally in how darning is functional, but then can move towards a more decorative expression when implemented in those ways. But they're certainly great. Those samplers are certainly great evidence to show that girls were learning this skill alongside things like cross stitch for marking their textiles for laundry and basic plain sewing before they move on to these more decorative expressions.
And you recently curated an exhibit of samplers, right?
I did. Yeah. I just guest curated a show called American Girlhood, which opened at the Webdean Stevens Museum in Wethersfield, Connecticut this spring. It's up through December 2026.
Oh, nice.
And there are several darning samplers in the exhibit. So I encourage folks to keep an eye out for those if they ever get a chance to see it in person.
What is it about this particular period that you find interesting? Did you come to it? Are you interested in the period and this is how you explore it as a textile historian? Or do you see yourself as a textile historian who is working in this period?
Oh, that's a great question. I really came to textiles through an interest in the history of women. And I was most interested in women in the 18th and 19th centuries. So many years ago, I was an English major in college. I was reading a lot of Victorian literature and thinking about these female characters and how they were using textiles in so many different ways. They were making them, they were wearing them. And it took me all 4 years of college at the very end to go, wait a second, I love reading about them, but I would love to look at them. Like these textiles that they're talking about are in museums, and I would appreciate having the chance to really get that proximity. But I think textiles more than anything are this medium that is, endlessly intimate. They're ephemeral. They're absorbing so much meaning and value for early Americans in this time period not only because of their economic value, but because of how we build relationships with objects in our life. And there's something quite timeless about that appeals to me. And so not to say that there's anything wrong with the 20th century. I love the 20th century, but there's just something I think quite wonderful about thinking about textiles when it takes up so much space in the daily lives of early Americans. That really interests me.
You use the word public history. What does that mean?
So public history, it's a great question. You can think of the field of history, as the study of the historical past. Public history is a subfield of that is really committed to public-facing historical inquiry. That can look like museums and historical sites, can look like interpretive signage in your local park or those classic historical markers you might see around your neighborhood. There's always people behind those. And it's also, I think public history has a real commitment to thinking through the historical past in relation to our present moment. And so I study public history as part of my graduate school studies, but I also think of it as a prong of this bigger project about mending, because I do think there are so many practical takeaways for museums beyond just a contributing part of the conversation about early American daily life and material culture.
That's interesting. And material culture is something that I didn't initially understand at first. It's like history through stuff, right?
Yeah. The history of stuff is, I think, the simplest way to get folks to understand it. But yeah, objects of our historical past. Mm-hmm. I often like to say that this is another reason I probably like the early American time period, but in many ways that is more of a material world than it is a written world. So many folks are experiencing and thinking through their daily existence, their larger meaning around the world, and they're making that meaning through things rather than writing it down. Not everyone was literate or able to document their own experience through the written word. And so I think there's so many more stories you get when you start thinking about objects alongside more traditional historical documents.
I was visiting a museum recently, and there is something really appealing about you can see the timeline of history, and then you can see the items that were really symbolic of that time, the lunch boxes, the TVs from the 60s, et cetera. And so who we were and what we had. So you're studying history, and yet you are a contemporary person. And so I'm curious how you think about textiles in the present moment and mending in the present moment and sort of the material culture of the present moment.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think it's one that I can't help but ask myself alongside, as I've been working on this project, because I feel like there are such present day stakes right now to our world of fashion, to the way we relate to textiles, to who makes those textiles. It's both, there's political stakes to that, there's ethical stakes to that. And this project, I think, for me, really began wanting to explore those kind of roots of repair to better understand some of our present moment too. Personally, I was motivated by that. Mending right now, while the techniques, I think, show such overlap to folks in the past, the quality of textiles and the rate in which we consume them today is so different. And it's hard, I think, to reconcile some of that in our present moment when we're thinking about what's worth repairing. When, maybe a t-shirt's only going to survive 7 washes, do you go through the effort of repairing that? And also thinking through the labor that produced that t-shirt to begin with. Just like today, there were systems of exploitive labor in the past, and repair doesn't always signify like a honest level of care that's freely given. Many times that care is also coerced. So I often like to underscore that overlaps so much with labor systems that produce textile and care for our textiles today on a broader scale. But mending is so much about your individual relationship with your textiles in your life. And I think no matter what, the opportunity to repair allows you to check in with those objects periodically. If something breaks, a textile in your house or that you wear, your favorite shirt, are you going through the effort of repairing that, even knowing that it may have cost you, I don't know, $30 at a fast fashion store today? Odds are there will always be people who will go to those lengths to repair something for what it means to them beyond its economic value. And I also think that there is such motivation today to be repairing, that there's so many different groups of people who find this politically powerful, ethically powerful, a valuable skill to practice and share with others, and an important rhythm in their lives now. And for me, it's been showing up as keeping a mending basket where if anything breaks, like I just put the textiles in the mending basket. I may not get to it immediately, but I'm trying to make that a embedded stage in my process. When something breaks, I'm like, this can be fixed. When I have the time, I will do it. And then I really treasure those moments when I have the opportunity to mend. And it's also such a vibrant opportunity to personalize textiles and to add new layers of meaning. I see such creativity online and in real life. So yeah, I'm hopeful that this fascination with mending continues even if we are not ourselves individually able to fix the world of fast fashion on a global level, there are so many forces at work that keep textile production so cheap and labor so exploited. But individual actions also bring, I think, unexpected benefits to our lives, even alongside that conversation.
I also think that at this point, there can be something where you're showing your values when you mend visibly, sort of like a badge of pride. You can't always tell when it used to be that I would say, I love your dress. And people would say, thanks, it has pockets. And now people say, thanks, I got it at the thrift store. And, and if you have something that's colorfully mended, it has a sort of I'm somebody who cared to embellish this or personalize it or save it.
Yeah. Yeah. There's a real empowerment in it. And I think that's also the power of fashion and textiles in general, is that across time, people are altering, modifying, buying secondhand, transforming textiles into what they need for themselves and their bodies and what they want to express for themselves and for the world. And there's so much opportunity to be expressive in those actions. And I think also a lot of joy in learning a skill. Mending, I think, as I mentioned, in these examples in the past, not all of them are well done. And they hold, I think, just as much, parallels to someone who's trying to mend their clothing for the first time in the present day. You might not have the best needlework execution, but doesn't mean it's not a worthwhile endeavor. And people in the past who were moving quickly and needed to fix something quickly, there's more similarities than differences there. So yeah, I just find such joy in its renewed interest today. I also think there's a real urgency to keep handwork and hand-based skills in our daily lives, especially as technology absorbs so much more and more of our time. There's a real power to checking in with your body and learning a skill that's new to create something that's tactile, that you experience through your body and not through a screen. Yeah, I find that just like good for well-being.
So what are you working on next?
I am very close to finishing my dissertation this summer, which I'm quite excited about. It's been a wonderful journey. And this fall, I am starting a postdoctoral fellowship at the Library Company of Philadelphia, where I will spend some time thinking about a possible book that's based on this dissertation topic. So I'm excited to kind of expand my horizons and think even more about mending in this way.
The Library Company of Philadelphia, is that something that has just books, or is it another collection of multiple kinds of items?
Library Company is a wonderful archive, many claims to fame, but the first is that they were the oldest library in the United States, founded by Benjamin Franklin in Philadelphia.
Wow.
And they have an incredible collection, mostly of paper archives, but also some textiles in their collection. They have objects and a wonderful graphic arts department, all of which are very helpful for me as I'm thinking about a possible. But it will be, I think, a wonderful year embedded in all sorts of amazing objects and documents and in a wonderful city for my time period.
I bet Benjamin Franklin would heartily approve.
I think he would. When the American Revolution was looming and he goes over to England to talk as a representative, there's this great speech where he's kind of threatening that early Americans will all wear old clothes if Britain doesn't meet their demands. They're like, we actually don't need you. We're going to be able to take care of our textiles on our own, even if you cut off supplies. And I find that, and he kept good on his promise. A lot of mending was done in the American Revolution because of it.
I'm sure.
But yeah, I think he would have heartily enjoyed some good thrift and economy happening in his world.
Well, Emily, thank you so much for telling me about your work.
Thanks so much for having me. This was such a pleasure.
Thanks to our sponsors for supporting the podcast. Thank you for listening to the Long Thread podcast. If you've enjoyed this episode, please rate the show and leave us a comment on Apple Podcasts or your favorite podcast platform. Thanks again.